Hello and welcome to the Inmenas podcast, a series by the Irish Network for Middle Eastern and North African Studies. Our podcasts centre innovative and provoking ideas from and about Southwest Asia and North Africa. We talk politics, feminism, racialization, and knowledge production with guests who challenge received wisdom. But first, what the heck is Inmenas? The Irish Network for Middle Eastern and North African Studies is a learned platform for the promotion of the study and understanding of the region in the island of Ireland. It builds on the growing network of Ireland-based scholars and practitioners with relevant expertise and on Ireland's outreach both towards the global north and the global south. We come from different disciplinary backgrounds, from literature, the arts, to political science, sociology, and the law, and are at different stages of our careers, from PhD candidates to full professors. Today, representing Inmenas on our inaugural episode are Dr. Paola Rivetti, a co-founding member of Inmenas and an associate professor at Dublin City University.
Hi, everyone.
Dr. Natasha Remoundou, a postdoc researcher at the National University of Ireland in Galway and lecturer in English and critical theory at the American College of Greece.
Good morning to everyone.
Nada Ahmed, a PhD researcher at Ulster University.
Hello, everyone.
And me, Sahar Ahmed, a doctoral candidate and early career researcher at Trinity College Dublin. At Inmenas, we are open and inclusive of all who wish to contribute to discussions and analysis about the past, present, and future of the region and Ireland, both North and South. And it is because of that that we are so excited to be speaking to our guests today, Ghiwa Sayegh and Sophie Chamas from the Body and Gender Research journal, Kohl. Kohl is a progressive feminist journal on gender and sexuality in the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and North Africa regions. Kohl Journal is a biannual, multilingual, open access and peer-reviewed academic journal targeting graduate-level academics, fresh graduates, independent writers, activists, researchers who are not affiliated with an academic institution as well. So, Ghiwa and Sophie, tell us a little bit about yourselves, please. So maybe let's start with you, Ghiwa.
Hello, and thank you for having me. So my name is Ghiwa Sayegh, and I am the founding editor of Kohl, a journal for body and gender research. I'm also a co-founder of Intersectional Knowledge Publishers, and I'm currently doing a master's in gender studies at Université Paris 8 Saint-Denis and Vincennes Saint-Denis in Paris. I'd just like to add before I hand it over to Sophie that with Kohl, we recently added the sentence that it's a queer radical publication from the South. So it's also like one of the ways we would like to present ourselves as of now, let's say.
Excellent, thank you so much. And Sophie?
Thanks, Sahar. Thanks for having me. So my name is Sophie Chamas. I'm currently a senior teaching fellow in gender studies at SOAS, University of London. I have a PhD in Middle East studies from the University of Oxford, and broadly, I work on the life, death, and afterlife of the radical political imagination in the Middle East and the global South more broadly. I've had a relationship with Kohl for a few years. I've contributed to the journal a few times and peer-reviewed for it a few times. I think it's one of the most exciting projects happening in the Middle East in terms of queer feminist knowledge production. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about its contributions today.
So thank you very much, Ghiwa and Sophie. I would like to start with a question, taking inspiration from what Sophie just said, and ask you what kind of scholarship Kohl wants to promote, how Kohl is different and new from what we already know.
Well, there's a part of it that's only new in certain contexts, let's put it that way, because it's part of a historical lineage, to put it, this way, that is queer, that is feminist, that is, based in the global South, and that is orientated towards this creation and co-creation of knowledge, except that, part of why Kohl is perceived as new in a way is because exactly this history is the history that's being erased over and over again. And so every time a new project is a bit more visible in academic circles, then it is automatically perceived as, doing something different. I mean, of course we are in different ways, but also like there's this acknowledgement for this history that we are also part of and that we have been part of as individuals, but also as collectives coming from specific political movements, but also ways of, envisioning how is it that we want to live in the worlds that we inhabit. And so Kohl comes from this very long belief that we must archive and document our histories. It's not like this idea in particular is not new. It's been written, at least in writing, in 2008 in Lebanon. But I'm sure that if we go back, there is a lot of history around this idea of passing on knowledge. Now, in terms of the scholarship, so there's the historical bit, but there's also like the place, the spot that Kohl would occupy in the world of academia and publishing, and how kind of rigid it has come to be. I'm not talking about the individuals that could occupy these spaces, but the systems themselves and how it's about like whether you're in or out and what you have to do to be in and the standards of publication and research and all of that. And I think in this way, there's a newness to Kohl because we do define as part, at least partially, academic, and we do present research, but it is not the research that is necessarily how to say this, that is like the one that would be necessarily approved by academic standards, and we do that on purpose. It's a political statement to say that basically there are many ways to do research. Not all of them are adapted. Like, I mean, the ones that are made legitimate are the ones that are adapted to the imagination that is very white, academic, institutionalized, and there are different ways of doing that that are also legitimate to pass on the knowledge that we want to pass on. And this is what it is about ultimately, like what the traces that we want to leave and the movements that we are archiving. And at the same time, I mean, in addition to this notion of transmission and passing on knowledge, there's also like pushing politically for the kinds of worlds and movements that we actually want to see. And I don't see this work as dissociated from, like, discursive knowledge work is not dissociated from activism and realizing political visions that we might look towards.
Thank you, Ghiwa. Sophie, do you want to add anything, or should I?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think, on top of everything that, Ghiwa put it quite eloquently in terms of what distinguishes Kohl, but also the lineage that it's part of. And I think that that's also very much part of, taking feminist praxis seriously, right? Emphasizing those histories, emphasizing who came before, who paved the way, and fighting certain forms of erasure and invisibility. The other thing that I would add that I think Kohl does and does really well is that it decenters both the traditional academy, but also the global north as the centers of theoretical production when it comes to queer feminist imaginaries. Scholars of sexuality in particular in the global south have often noted how, their work is relegated to area studies, right? They're told that, queer subjects, feminist subjects in the global South are always treated like data, and, data to which you apply Western theory. And at the same time, the people who have been given the opportunity to push back against that have still been scholars of color who are based in the global North. And I think that Kohl, it challenges the centrality of the Western Academy, but it also challenges the centrality of the global North, and the idea that it is always the diasporic scholar based in the global North Academy who can then theorize about their home, and the home that they left behind. So I think that it is, it's a journal that is producing theory, and it is theory by and for the people who are living those experiences and theorizing based on those experiences, rather than just kind of presenting their narratives for other people to theorize about. And so I think that the theoretical contribution of the journal is really unique and really important.
Thank you very much. And considering all the intersections that Kohl wants to inhabit, so academic, but also subverting in a way the way in which we produce knowledge in academia. So what kind of work went into the establishment of an academic journal of this type, considering its positionality, but also considering the group that is behind Kohl, so women, early career researchers from the South?
I mean, it was a long journey, let's put it this way. It was a long journey that was also punctuated by the historical happenings in Lebanon and in the region, because, I mean, this is where we were created. I mean, this is where Kohl was created, and therefore we had to contend with whatever political, economic crisis came our way. Initially, I think what was important to us, and still is right now, was the notion of fully accessible and like fully free and accessible knowledge that is available online. Like anyone can just go on our website and read Kohl, and that was really important because part of the issue was that. So initially, historically, as Sophie just said, in terms of being treated as data, like we were always the subjects of research, of other people's research, and writings, or even like journalistic pieces, etc. And so eventually, when we wanted to access those pieces, it was impossible because we would hit a paywall, and so even our own. I mean, regardless of there's also a lot to say about the methodology, but let's put it like just on a very, access level. It was impossible to have that access because, the article would cost $40, for example, or we needed to be affiliated with an academic institution to be able to read what is supposed to be, ours in a way. And so this was really important to us, except of course, we then ended up with other questions and other preoccupations that had to do with how do we get funding, and how is it that we make it sustainable? How is it that at the same time, we make sure that it is a workplace that has decent, work conditions, and so all of these questions, the idea, like this grappling with NGOization that we had to do throughout the years, and that we are still, thinking through, I think it's kind of maybe not softened, but it really made us think about what are the systems that we really come up against. And this is really one of them, in the sense that, I mean, it's great to want to do something different, but at the end of the day, we're always in and out of systems of power, whether we want it or not. So escaping academic institutions was possible, but that also meant that we had to then contend with other systems of power, and namely, this idea of getting funding and having to professionalize in order for, the work to be remunerated and all of that and all the questions that come with it. So it's a bit different than the academic considerations, but they're still there. And for me, ultimately, they're part of the same, you know, neoliberal capitalist way of doing things. It's true that then in the actual knowledge and the process of creating knowledge together, we do have some room that might not have been possible had we been like part of an academic institution or funded by an academic publisher. So for instance, like one of the major, like really major issue that we keep coming up against with the authors is how to write ourselves back into the text. And I think a lot of times in academic publishing, not a lot of times, we are systematically taught that there has to be a distance between like us as the author and or the researcher and what we are talking about, even when what we are writing about is something deeply personal and our own history. So, and I think part of Kohl's work and, you know, this ability of existing outside of academic institutions at least made it so that it was possible to then reclaim actually those spaces of writing that we are doing so that it's not completely separate from you know who we are as a collective, as you know, historically, but also as individuals. And then obviously, on the other hand, what I was talking about before in terms of the trajectory of Kohl being punctuated by what's going on in Lebanon, we eventually had to actually leave. And so we're now based in two places. We're still based in Beirut, but we're also based in France. And this had to do with the economic crisis and the inability to continue functioning the way we did, and we could, because of, you know, this complete impasse that we were in economically. And this brought with it different considerations that we can talk about in a bit about, you know, what does it mean to be both based in the global north, even as, you know, migrants, and in the global south at the same time, and what does this do to the way we, you know, we work together and approach this co-creation that we do.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much. I'd like to move on, if that's all right now. And I think Natasha has some interesting questions for the both of you.
Thank you, Sahar. Yes, I'm listening with great interest to both Ghiwa and Sophie talking about all these ideas of resistance and memory, especially in relation to lineages and genealogies of feminist thought. But based on what you just said, Ghiwa, I would like just, if you could talk a bit more about this idea of being a feminist, but also a migrant, and this liminality that is inherent in this position. Especially in this idea of feeling often a stranger for being a feminist, but also for being a migrant, and often having this sense of feeling disenfranchised, of not belonging either or. How has this experience been for you? And I would like to connect this question to what you both mentioned about lineages of feminist memory. You know, Sahar Ahmed mentions that citation is feminist memory. So I would like to know which are these lineages that you look back to in order to enact feminism in the present and form new intersectional feminist solidarities.
Sophie, do you want to go first? Okay. Yes, I mean, I have obviously a personal story of, you know, this liminality and embodying it in a way, but it's also important to note that it's not an exceptional story. It's actually a story that's quite common, and that, you know, if we put all the images together, it kind of forms a collective traumatic memory that we carry. And I think it has to do with the notion that, you know, we all, I mean, there's always this idea that I don't really understand about certain political ideologies. I mean, this criticism that certain political ideologies in the global South are Western, like imposed, like there's a Western imposition to them. And I'm always surprised by this argument because it kind of reproduces the notion that there can only ever be one point or one site of emergence to certain political currents or thoughts or ideologies. Now, of course, if we look at global circulations, that really have to do with this notion of neocolonialism, neoliberalism, and how certain identity formations happen on a global level, then yes, there is a critique to be made. But to go back to the notion of ideology, I think it's not only unfair, but it also reproduces this kind of systemic violence and erasure to attribute feminism or whatever to the West or queer theory. And I'm making that point to say that I did not feel foreign or a stranger as a feminist in my back home. And in fact, it's exactly that. It's understanding that also these notions of essentializing whatever culture or societies or whatever might exist in the global South, I think is also like quite challenged by this idea that we can be feminist in our home countries and create movements and do work and archive. It's just that it's either erased or seen as something completely exceptional and therefore foreign to society because we essentialize society. Now, this said, the feeling of foreignness, I think, had more to do with the loss of everything that looked familiar, and that, there was really something very special about this foreignness that I felt before leaving, and that had to do with first the economic crisis combined with the pandemic and lockdown, and how that looked in really everyday life, like going to the supermarket, leaving your house, trying to walk in the streets, and even I don't know, there was something about facial features in general, and then and even this being completely then I don't know how to call it, but really pulled apart with the explosion on August 4. And so my experience with that was that suddenly, even the features of the city had, I mean, I could move freely because I knew how to move from one place to another, but what I saw had nothing to do with what I had in my memory. And 20 days later, I was gone to a new country, I migrated to France literally 20 days later. So it wasn't enough time to really settle into this new reality that I had to settle into a new one that was completely foreign, where maybe some landscapes were familiar, but I could not orientate myself for a very long time. And even now that things are reopening again, I'm also relearning, because also being here in times of pandemic was completely, it was something, it's not the same spatial configuration that we find, basically. In terms of how do we link that in terms of Kohl, I think that because our stories are always also histories, right? It's not exceptional because a lot of people also either went through this or went through this process and did not leave, had to deal with whatever consequences of, the combination of, explosion, economic crisis and pandemic had. And of course that we feel as well, because, we are still tied to our home countries. But I think in terms of Kohl, how this translates is really rethinking what does it mean to be rooted in a place, right? And when we are uprooted anyway, what does it mean to be rooted? Because we were as a feminist journal, but then maybe we weren't as much as a journal that was trying, that was, aspiring for different realities and political imaginaries that really had to do with how is it that we change the system from its roots. And I think this is really the core of the struggle. It's being able to demand radical change without always or having to define ourselves only in relation to those systems of power.
Yeah, I guess I can speak to the question of citation and feminist lineages. I mean, I'm somebody who's never really lived in any one place for a very long time. I left Beirut when I was 13 and, you know, have been moving ever since. And so I don't really have much of a sense of home to anywhere. And that's informed my thinking about post-colonial identity. I'm not really a fan of the hybrid framework. I'm somebody that is an obvious candidate for the hybrid identity. English is my first language, even though I grew up in the Middle East, grew up with an affinity within American schools with a deep connection to American culture that then gets disrupted when I moved to the US to do my master's. And I realized that the things that make me un-American are actually very, very, very small things. It's not the accent or popular culture or the way I dress it. It was my conception of hospitality, for example. And so I'm more of a fan of thinking of post-colonial identity as fragmented and then or fractured, and then using that as a springboard for thinking about becoming in a feminist way and in a queer way. So kind of thinking against the need for a stable identity or a territorial identity. And that's how I think about citation. So I connect, thinking about connections with Indigenous scholarship or with the Black feminist tradition and finding and feeling an affinity with that literature and feeling at home with certain feminist works and with certain feminist thinkers. And that's more of how I think about citation, because I think, when I think about the Middle East, queer feminist spaces are also fraught with tension. And with personal animosities and with the kind of conflict that emerges from being sharing intimate spaces with people for a very, very long time on the peripheries of society. And so I think that, I've always been more interested in citing the work that speaks to me and that I feel at home with, rather than demonstrating through my work a particular loyalty to the nationality that I have or the region that I come from. So, an affinity with scholars who are either from the global South more generally or from its diasporas, and who are grappling with those experiences. Rather than, I think sometimes citational politics can be a bit performative, and I'm more interested in citing those whose work speaks to me, and then in building feminist community that way. So really, I think of citational politics through the transnational feminist frame. I think that feminism, to be truly revolutionary, needs to be transnational, and needs to transcend borders and transcend national affiliations. And so that's, but that's also very particular to my experience, having never spent long enough in one place to build community in that place. And so, my affinities have always been with what I read and the people that I encounter, rather than the places that I've been in, if that makes sense.
Maybe I just like to add to that, it's true that sometimes, with Kohl, but also my personal work, it's like looking at the bibliography also tells a story. And a lot of times, like even things, or texts that have been not really worked, but like things that have been said by different people, right? Because there is a common history. So if I'm thinking about the history of the queer feminist movement in Lebanon, I mean, yes, there were many people who wrote about it, but then the choice of whom to cite is for me also political, because a lot of times we're encouraged to cite somebody who's been published in a whatever in a known academic journal, who is while actually this knowledge was made available by people who who are activists, who maybe never published in an academic journal but have written in blogs that maybe no longer exist. So doing that work of just going back, for example, to the internet archives and retrieving those articles is also, I mean, it's not in the product that we present out there. And maybe that's also an answer to how Kohl is feminist, right? Because it's not just about, so we're going to write something that has a feminist framework to it, but also like really digging and doing that work of telling a story that is not as evident because of erasure, basically, even through citation and the bibliography that we put out there.
And I think that was, thank you so much, Ghiwa. And I think like Nada has a follow-up question from that now, I think.
Thank you, Ghiwa and Sophie, for this interesting conversation. My question is related to inspiration. So how and why did you start Kohl, and how was the Arab Spring something that contributed to? I mean, our region is very moving all the time. But the Arab Spring was quite significant, I guess, especially related to social issues. Maybe on the political front, we didn't make much progress, but I mean, I think that on the social level. So did this make was one of your inspirations, or just something else was the inspiration for you to start Kohl?
Actually, it is linked to the revolutions that happened in the region, but maybe not as directly as that, because the story was that I mean, it happened before, right, in 2007, 2008, 2009. But then with the revolutions and with the popular uprisings, there was this sudden influx of researchers to the region. And I think, when they wanted to research LGBT or, LGBT identities, then, the easiest place to go was Beirut. And now in retrospect, there's always this notion of, Beirut being the place where these things are possible. In retrospect, I say that we've paid a heavy price for these things to be possible, because for me, it was betting on the notion that, there would be this limited kind of freedom, while on the economic level, there's, this kind of complete occupation of all economic spaces that was only made possible via giving people some room in terms of freedom. So it's a system for me that works in this way, which is a bit different than, other contexts in the region. And so I think it became easier for researcher and journalists, at least during that time, like 2010 to 2015, to then flock to Beirut looking for, the gays. And I mean, it happened before, but I think it was really intensified during that time. And Kohl came as, because also, we were thinking about Orientalism and what it meant, and who can do research and who can write and who has the authority to do so. And it came a bit as a response to all of that. And I think it's obvious in the first issue. I was reading my intro like a couple of days ago, actually, and how we positioned ourselves in terms of wanting to rethink what does it mean to build intersections, what it means to write, etc. So that was yeah, initially what we were trying to do, but I think that, and luckily it's shifted quite a lot throughout the years, and it's a conversation that I also often have with Sophie about how is it that we create and embody utopias. And I think just being stuck in this framework where we can only ever respond to the discourses that are written about us reinforces the discourses that are written about us, because then, you know, our position is always one of opposition, and we cannot really like just do what's important to us and what is it that we want to do. And I think because we were caught up in so many political moments, like the revolution that, you know, we fully took part of, and then had to shift everything, and we did it gladly with, you know, a lot of political duty in mind. And then the economic crisis and the explosion, I think we really had to deal with this question of, no, we do not want to respond to like white researchers who have no idea what they're doing, you know, or journalists who write sensationalist pieces, or even this notion of, you know, weird global LGBT identity politics that are then, you know, applied because of economic motives and political motives. And so it's really this idea of like, how is it that we can then build something else? And this something else, just by virtue of its existence, is resistance to the system in place. And I think this is the question that's really on our minds, with the knowledge that we cannot fully walk away because, you know, we always have some kind of complicity in the systems that we are part of, because, you know, there's no disconnect. It's just that we need to, you know, widen the possibilities of what can be made outside of it.
Sophie, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I would add on, you know, I think that this has been, you know, gender and sexuality studies at the intersection of Middle East studies, you know, it has been for a very long time preoccupied with speaking back to the West and speaking back to American empire in particular. And as a result, has produced extremely valuable work that has questioned, you know, the paradigm of the Muslim woman as victim, narratives of false consciousness, the idea, the universalization of particular conceptions of freedom, of liberalism. You know, I'm thinking of people like the late Sabah Mahmoud, for example. That is extremely valuable work, but it also, you know, I think it got to a point where that was the majority of what was being produced in the discipline, which meant that other ways of being in the Middle East that maybe look familiar from a Western vantage point get, you know, if not ignored, then looked at through the prism of Western imperialism, or get looked at, you know, get examined based on their relationship to piety within their context, right? Are you, as a secular feminist, reproducing discourse about Muslim women? And then that becomes the focus, right? And so, you know, something I noticed when I moved back to Beirut for my fieldwork was the pain that, you know, people felt at having been erased within the literature about about gender and sexuality in their own regions. And I think, you know, pain and anger and rage, because they were reading this work and they didn't have the spaces to respond to it. And so that element of, you know, on the one hand, that literature was speaking truth to power, but then there was a power dynamic where it was also complicit in certain forms of erasure. And I think that we're seeing gradually now a desire to, you know, acknowledge that you can never fully ignore the West because of the material power dynamics that shape our lives, but that, you know, that fear of what America or Americans will think, of what Europeans will think, of how, you know, of the possibility that certain stereotypes will be reinforced, that cannot be how we live our lives, because then we're sacrificing our own futures for fear of how our narratives might be weaponized, because in the end, they're being weaponized whether we say anything or not, you know? And so I think that, we should be able to talk about gender-based violence in our own societies without having to constantly qualify it by saying this is not about exceptional Arab masculinity. You know, I think there are ways in which you can couch what you say in the fact that patriarchy is a universal problem, and that people are victims of gender-based violence everywhere, right? And not just in the Middle East. And so I think that, we need to break out of this constant fear of being misrepresented, or else we get stuck in a perpetual present, I think, where we're incapable of actually moving towards our own utopian visions.
I would like to ask both Ghiwa and Sophie to tell us what are you reading at the moment, a cliche question, which is your feminist survival toolkit that you could share with us in relation to literature or critical theory. But also I like what you say about how being feminist enacts a kind of feminism inside and outside of academia. So I would like to know, how do you stand in front of this? How do you stand opposite this? Who are the people that you admire that have informed your work or inspired your work inside and outside of academia?
Well, what I'm reading at the moment is actually a lot of articles for Kohl's next issue. But actually, I'm also reading this anthology that was published in 2001 in France, and it was the first anthology of its kind written by lesbians of color. And it was something like really, it was a group called Groupe du 6 Novembre, so the 6th November group, and they self-published an anthology that is out of print and has writings by different lesbians of color, who are either Black or, North African. And I read about the anthology. It was really an interesting process because I'm trying to, it is linked to the work that Kohl is doing, because we are thinking of how is it that we can, work transnationally and make transnational links, not only geographically, but also if we look at time, as another dimension. And I'm thinking of this anthology in relation to the anthologies that we might have produced, like Barid Mustajil later on in Beirut. And like, of course, the genealogies are different, but there are genealogies that are also common, and it's looking at that. And so this book called Warriors, Guerrières, it's really like out of print, was printed once. I tried to look for it. I then found it in an archive. But eventually, after a few months, I was able to get a copy from one of the founders of the group, and it's, it's something that I treasure a lot at the moment, and that's what I'm reading. Generally, I think my bio still says, or used to say, that my influences are Sahar Ahmed and Audre Lorde. But also my influences are really like, if I look at, because, since I'm writing this thesis, then, it also helps me look at, this bibliography that I keep going back to. And I think a lot of it has to do with the writings that we produced in the 2000s, and that are no longer fully accessible. Like, I have to go back to the web archives, the internet archives, to retrieve them. And they are articles that were published in Bakhsous, for example. It was a queer magazine that we had, and whatever came out of it. But also, like, a lot of it is, already work that was being done across borders, because, the way we built this way of writing and writing as doing, was not only, something that's based in Beirut, but also the work that we did transnationally, and most importantly with queer activists in Palestine. So I remember that my formative years politically were about how to talk about, like how is it that we can together produce decolonial knowledge that also resists forms of normalization that were already apparent and starting in LGBT identity politics circles. And this was really like, for me, it was the notion that queer is decolonial. And to go back to the story of the anthology, when I came here, I found out that queer does not necessarily have to be decolonial, or at least this is how it is perceived here. And then bringing both together as something that, and it's not just, putting two identities together. It's not just an intersection, right? It's something else completely. Like it's really something else. And just embodying that something else has been quite challenging, but also interesting, and responds to what Sophie has said in terms of, understanding why is it that certain knowledge is produced the way it is because of this proximity to empire, but also understanding how it can travel in a way that can cause this pain and anger in different communities, basically.
So in terms of what I'm reading right now, so I'm running a reading group for my students, and that's also part of, my understanding or my personal philosophy of sort of how to bring radical, conceptions of care and, feminist conceptions of care into the classroom. Creating spaces outside of the classroom, outside of, being marked and being assessed, to really think with each other and with, students with one another, but then with their lecturers is quite important to me. And I started this last year at the start of the pandemic to give students a space to really come to terms with sort of their on-campus life abruptly ending, and then also having to, deal with the pandemic. And I decided to continue it. And so one of the themes that the students expressed an interest in was radical self-care and queer care. And so I've really been kind of designing a lot of the recommended readings around that. And so we're currently reading Carmen Maria Machado's memoir, In the Dream House, which is a story about queer domestic abuse, but also about radical care, self-care, but also communal care. And I think that what's really special about that memoir is it also pushes against conventional ways of thinking about personal failure and personal weakness. And that's something that we've been talking about collectively in that reading group, that this injunction to be strong and to, always be strong, and to be a feminist is to be strong and tough and to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And I'm really, because of my own sort of personal life journey, trying to kind of get them thinking about, what happens when you sit with weakness or you sit with brokenness, and what happens if we hold each other as people who are being broken over and over again in many ways, as opposed to kind of demanding, strength and sort of flexing from one another constantly. And so it's been a very therapeutic space. And, so when a key part of my sort of feminist sense of self and my journey with queer feminism has been influenced by my students and by the relationship that I've developed with them in the classroom. That, I've been looking for my political space for a very long time. I work on activism, so I've moved in a lot of spaces, and I've never quite felt that I was right in, in terms of not a great organizer, not a great protester. I'm a bit, shy. I'm not really confrontational. And it's really in the classroom that I found my political voice and my political purpose. And, I believe that a pedagogy is politics. And so right now for me, it's not, there are the people that I read, but then there are people that I live my life with. And these are my students, but then also my friends, people like Ghiwa, people who are producing knowledge, but also rethinking it constantly and really trying to infuse their practice with care, building relationships with other people that hinge on supporting work that you want to see out in the world, and not that hinge on your own sort of career trajectory. So, really kind of, I was just having this conversation with two friends yesterday about rethinking the idea of the academic network as your kind of lifeline. And what if the network is your community, and, the people who are caring for you because they're invested in you, and not because you doing well is going to make their own work look good or is going to create an indebtedness, right? And so that is the sort of community from which I currently derive strength right now. And then with text, I always have to say Jose Munoz, because he changed my life, and everything that I do is indebted to his thinking about utopia and queerness and the political imagination, and my own personal journey with queerness as something that is not just about your identity and not just about your desire, but about the very way in which you orient yourself in the world, is also heavily indebted to him. So I always feel I have to mention him.
I might take liberties at this point and sneak in an extra question that I have been mulling over since the two of you started speaking to us. And as someone who, grew up in the global South, I was born in Pakistan. I didn't move out of Pakistan till I was in my 20s. And I've only in the last 5 years been actively away for a long period of time. One of the great anxieties of my life is becoming diaspora, right? And both of you were talking about this earlier as well, in terms of not just redirecting the gaze away from the white scholars and academics writing about us, but also the diaspora writing about us, right? And I would love to hear what the two of you have felt. And I know, Sophie, you talked about never really having a specific home because of having moved around so much, but still, with you having moved around so much, Ghiwa, you have recently moved away, and with the journal also no longer specifically being like physically housed in Beirut, for example, and now being in France, have you seen a change in your writing, in how you contribute to your writing, but also as an editor? Like for both of you, what do you feel yourself relying on nostalgia? Because that's something I've started doing recently and I hate it. And I would just love to hear how this has affected your work as writers, as editors, both. Sophie, either one of you, please go ahead.
I can go first. I mean, yes, I am also struggling with this notion of becoming diaspora, and I think like the notion is shocking to me still. I left Lebanon 3 days before I turned 31, so it's like, for me, it's really like everything. Like I was formed politically, personally, like on all levels in Beirut and Lebanon more broadly. And whatever, like everything that has to do with, intersectionality, but not in the sense of identity of one individual, but really like thinking through refuginess and migrant domestic work, and what does it mean when we're not those communities. It all comes from home. It doesn't come from here. And now suddenly I'm a migrant, and this comes with other considerations as well. I mean, it's quite, I had not expected it to be so violent, but the embodying the migrant is really, it's like constant I mean, obviously I knew that from back home, but I knew it for other people. And then suddenly coming into it, I think that yes, there is a geographical distance that is marked by historical power dynamics, right? But there's also a closeness that gets created because living that experience, even if in a different context, brings, other considerations. On the other hand, I have to say that I was quite haunted by, my life in Beirut for a long time. And to go back to what Natasha was saying about liminality, I really felt that I was in the in-between for months. And that was exacerbated by lockdown and the pandemic and all of that, like being stuck in one apartment, right? And so I started experiencing my body as a specter, like something ghostly that was neither here nor there. And it was quite disturbing for a while. But I have to say that eventually without me noticing, it faded away. And when it faded away, parts of my memory did as well. And I only realized a few days ago, and it was quite shocking. I was giving an interview for a friend of mine, actually, who was talking about it's more like the queer spaces in Beirut. So we're really talking about the streets, the reference points of the city. And I just found myself forgetting names and like of places I've lived in my whole life, actually, or like reference places that were references, like, for example, at the time of the revolution. And it was quite like, that was the moment where I was like, okay, I see how I can become diaspora, which was not as evident to me before. But I feel that, this transition is in the making. And I think, to do that and not to reproduce the same, of course, I can reflect on my experience in those 31 years, which is already a historical life, right? Like this lived, reality that I had for 31 years, it cannot be erased. But I think because of the situation right now, of course, we can support, with the economic crisis, really, like, it just keeps getting worse, if worse is possible. I think it's different kinds of solidarity that is required of us in that moment as well. And this is why I'm trying to turn towards, at least in my contribution to Kohl, to like making the transnational links without appropriating the local stories, if it makes sense. Because I think this liminal position, as I was saying before, allows me to see why certain knowledges are important in proximity to systems of power, but how they should not or could not travel, and how to make sure that this travel happens in a way that doesn't reproduce violence as well, because there are ways of doing that. And this is what I'm mostly like focused on right now. Like on the Kohl level, of course, it translates into more transnational work, but then other people will pick up on the work that is being done, like particularly in relation to Lebanon, the region, who are still based in the region, and not me, basically.
Yeah, I am a diasporic academic, right? As in I did my PhD in the West, and so I've always been writing, even though I did grow up in the Middle East my whole life, but I've always written about it from the Global North Academy. What I always say is what I try to do with my work is to theorize more broadly about activism, the decline of the left, the decline of the political imagination, by using the Middle East to think more broadly about these questions. So I don't try to make a parochial exceptional argument about the Middle East. I try to argue that what's happened in the region in terms of social movements and activism is indicative of trends on a global scale. And that's also part of my desire to push back against the tendency within academic writing on especially the political economy of the region to really kind of fixate on, you know, corruption or crony capitalism, sectarianism, ethnic strife, religious strife. I'm more interested in neoliberalism. I'm more interested in securitization and mechanisms of power we consider Western, and we usually conceive of them as only ever being imposed on the Middle East rather than weaponized by states in the Middle East. And so I don't use sectarianism as a lens to think about Lebanon. I use neoliberalism and securitization. And I think that if sectarianism is the only framework we use to make sense of what it is to be a gendered or sexualized subject in the Middle East, then we're really missing a big part of the picture. And we're also missing parallels. In my work, for example, I draw heavily on the literature on middle-class activism in India, because I think that the parallels are fascinating. You know, there's a lot to be done if you do kind of a comparative analysis of how middle-class professionals have come to predominate in certain sectors of Indian activism, especially around urban issues. And you look at what's happened in Lebanon. If I only use a Middle East framework to think about urban activism in Lebanon, I'll miss a huge part of the picture, right? So I'm interested in saying that actually the Middle East can be a microcosm, and we can think about sort of these global processes. And then if you are working on Spain, you can come and read my work on Lebanon and use that to think about Spain. Often things go in the reverse, right? We'll use a text about you know, Spain or about Italy or about the US to think about the Middle East, but the reverse doesn't really happen. And that's what I'm invested in. And I think that's a better way of using my position as somebody who's no longer rooted back home, and you know, for very personal reasons, I think that my I don't, you know, I have a very a traumatic relationship with Lebanon, and I don't know that that's a relationship that can actually be fixed. I always felt out of place because I moved around so much, and because I grew up mostly in the Gulf in American schools. And so, you know, what is it to grow up in a mini America or a mini Texas in Qatar? You know, you're not, it doesn't really feel like you were growing up somewhere Arab either, you know? And so I've always felt more at home with the diaspora or with migrants. So when I moved here, I felt an immediate affinity with Arabs who had been here for a while and were grappling with that diasporic identity. And so part of what I'm trying to do in my work is to actually shift towards questions of migration and diaspora, because I also feel that there's a personal entanglement with it, an affinity, something I can understand, because I don't want to continue writing about the region if I feel that I'm unable to return there or you know, invest in it because of personal traumas, you know. And so it creates this political problem for me. Well, if I feel that the diaspora is now my home for very complex reasons, then maybe I should be studying the diaspora because I see myself in it. And that's a shift that also happened because of teaching about migration and diaspora at SOAS, which was a topic I didn't previously have expertise in. And I got asked to teach this class. It ended up being the greatest experience of my life, and it completely shifted what I wanted to work on.
Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today, for kicking off the Inmenas podcast series with such an exciting and interesting conversation. And I think I can speak on behalf of all of us for really giving us a really enriching discussion with loads to think about and mull over. So thank you so much from all of us. And stay tuned to Kohl, guys, because exciting work will be coming up, I think.
I hope so.
Thank you.